Okay, so let's move seamlessly into the panel discussion where we're going to take a look at what the lessons we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic for climate change. And I'm delighted that we've got three, well, varied speakers on our panel this afternoon. I'm going to start with Stuart, who's on my left here. Stuart Bruce is Director of Climate Risk and Strategy at KPMG. In the middle, we have Tara Breyer, who is the Science Communications Advisor at Climate Outreach. And on the far left of me is Jim Needle, who is Chief Client Officer at Ipsos UK. And a big thank you to Jim, who stood in at very short notice for one of his colleagues. So a variety of different backgrounds of people, but all certainly have knowledge and interest in both the COVID-19 pandemic and the communication and science around that pandemic, and particularly its role within climate change. So I'm going to take questions from the audience in a minute and from online, as we've been doing through the afternoon. But I'm going to pose a question first to the panel, which you know what's coming, so that's good. A brief introduction from yourself as well as you go through. But my question really, I mean, we've known, you know, the COVID pandemic and climate change are both challenges that are on local, national and international scales. And also to kind of solve those problems needs to be done at local, national and international levels. They both require urgent action at different scale, but we can learn a lot, I think, from the COVID pandemic. So my first question really to you all is there one take-home, one lesson that we've learned from COVID-19 that would be useful to apply for how we tackle climate change? So I'll start with Stuart.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good. Brilliant. Great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. Yeah, Stuart Bruce, Director of Climate Risk and Strategy at KPMG. I'll firstly just introduce myself, my team does, just to give some context, and then I'll try to come up with a clever answer to your question. So my team is about 2 years old. KPMG has some pedigree in climate change, but the current team is about 2 years old. And its purpose really is to change the hearts and minds of corporate Britain. We work from the top down, CEOs and boards down, to help educate and inform and agitate for greater change around climate change. It's one thing to have statements, it's something to have action. And we're very focused on pragmatic action to help companies decarbonize, because of course they'll be doing much of the heavy lifting to hit the net zero targets that have been set by governments around the world. In that we do a whole range of activities. Some of you may know the acronym TCFD. It's about reporting on your climate financial disclosures to the market, so how climate change impacts the value of your company over time and how you build a resilience to your company over time, and to capitalize on emerging trends and themes, you know, EV and green products, etc. So we do that, but also transition plans is a really important piece of what we do, which is helping companies figure out the nuts and bolts and the governance about how they decarbonize their business over time. Linked to this is all kinds of things around carbon markets and increasingly biodiversity and the natural environment as well is an important part of this. That's my team. I joined about 18 months ago. And before that, I spent about 12 years in consulting between strategy and law, and also worked with the Climate Change Secretariat in the day when they were designing the Paris Agreement, which was very fun. And more recently, I've become one of the independent expert reviewers for the IPCC AR6 in Working Group 3. So a slightly longer introduction, but hopefully it sets the scene. In answer to your question, I think what we have shown through COVID is that as a species and as a society, we are highly adaptable. And indeed, to respond to climate change and prevent the worst effects of climate change in time, we need to adapt quicker, smarter, and faster. The trigger for COVID in causing that adaptation was very visual, very present, very immediate. It affected so many of us, and many people in this room have been affected by COVID. There was a palpable need to respond and mitigate the worst of it. That trigger is less visible in many respects with climate change, because although we're experiencing climate change now, reduced Arctic sea ice, greater heat waves, droughts, increasing in flood levels, there's still this sense that it's, you know, down the track. It's 10 years away, it's 20 years away, it's 30, 40 years away for the worst effects of the physical impacts of climate change. And therefore, psychologically, it's hard for the individual to grasp the necessity to change now and respond because there's a less immediate threat. But I think we have shown through COVID that we can do that with the right incentives and indeed the right assistance from government and business. And so my general comment is that we can adapt, we need to adapt. If we wait for the trigger to adapt, it'll be too late. Happy to add some more detail to that shortly.
Thank you. Sarah.
Right, so my name is Tara Breyer, and I work for Climate Outreach, and where our HQ is in Oxford, but actually now that we started working remote, we're growing an international team. And so we exist because we really believe that in order to tackle climate change, you need a fully 100% engaged community, engaged society to achieve that. And in particular, what's really important for us is to reach out to those more marginalized communities, so particularly those who've been ignored from the climate change conversation from the outset, and working out how can we use the social science, how can we use our understanding on behavior change to reach out to those wider audiences. And also in understanding who are those critical stakeholders out there as well, who we could call key messengers, who may be more trusted than us to actually engage wider audiences. And in particular, one of those is climate experts like you in the room. So my job is to equip and empower climate experts like yourselves to feel confident, to feel like you have a toolbox to go out there and reach those harder to reach audiences. And you would have a better impact than maybe politicians or other members of civil society. So yeah, I typically move around the country meeting with academics and doing day-long trainings and then forcing them to go out and sit on a panel, which is a lot of fun. And yeah, so the one lesson that we can learn from COVID, so very unusually for a charity, like I saw a lot of colleagues actually lose work during the pandemic, but actually this is the busiest we've ever been, because as an organization focusing on human attitudes and behaviors to crisis, a lot of work came in because a lot of people were making the connections between our societal response to COVID and what bridges we could tie to a societal response to climate change. And I mean, we can learn a lot from it, because what we've seen is that public engagement is really important. The government did invest in public engagement because they knew they needed to help people understand the nature of the virus in order to be able to tolerate the restrictions they were about to face, but also give the government a critical mandate to do more. So our research team worked with a group called CAST, so they stand for the Centre of Climate Change and Social Transformation, and actually surveyed segments of the British population last year in the middle of lockdown to see if they could make any links between the perceptions of climate change in light of COVID. And 3 key things came out of that in light of the importance of public engagement. And one thing is that we need to be very mindful when it comes to public engagement, especially with making direct links between our response to COVID and what we need to do to respond to climate change as well. Because we've all had a really hard time with lockdown. And if we start using narratives like, well, you've done it for lockdown, now we need to do it for climate change, we will expect a lot of opposition from that. So we need to recognize that people have gone through some hard times, even though they've made some major transformations, as Stuart just mentioned. Another thing is public engagement really needs to be empowering. So we've seen what people who have a sense of agency are capable of doing. And also the use of trusted messengers in sharing that information about what we do, such as Surveillance and Chris Whitty as well, telling us what we need to do, which is stay at home. So people had a piece of agency, they knew what their responsibility was. They stayed at home because they knew that was how they would stop the transfer of the virus. And then finally, what I feel is really exciting is that public engagement needs to be or have people at the heart of it. So by understanding people's values, identities, worldviews, how they respond to a story is really important when we want to engage people and bring people on a journey. So where are they at? And how can we bring them into the story so it resonates for them with some meaning so that they can feel empowered to take action on that as well. So yeah, my one lesson is a strong public engagement strategy. I'll stop battling on.
Thanks, Sarah. Jim.
Hi, those of you who don't know who Ipsos are, you might know Ipsos Mori. So everyone's probably in the room, all nodding heads, all know Mori. It's part of the same business. And we spend our life talking to consumers and governments and advising brands and governments on what consumer sentiment is, how people are feeling about the world around them, society, brands, climate change, coronavirus. And we're polling somewhere in the world pretty much every minute of every day across about 100 countries. So building on what Stuart said and what Tara was talking about, working with CAST, making sure we're finding out what is the sentiment of the British public, so governments and to a certain extent brands can make the right decisions around how we move forward. So I don't want to bury everyone in statistics, but the whole coronavirus period for the UK, and in answer to your question, Liz, has thrown up some really, really interesting changes in consumer behaviour, but it's forced changes in consumer behaviour. It isn't changes in consumer behaviour because consumers a lot of the time wanted to change. So I think the parallel between them is not as strong as some people would say. So we had no choice but to stay at home. We had no choice but to wear masks. There was a choice whether to get vaccinated or not, but the majority followed what central government wanted. So the lessons we can learn from the pandemic, I think you need to be really, really careful about drawing parallels between the two. However, there are things we can look at. We can look at, we've seen a marked uptick in the expectations of the British public on how the government behave. There's a much higher expectation of the government to do the right thing, which might make you laugh at the current time with what's been going on with our government. However, there is an expectation post-pandemic that actually it may have taken the government a while to get to the right place, but we were the spearheads of vaccinations, and some of the countries who closed their borders and sent people home didn't vaccinate, and actually now are paying the cost of that and the price of that. So there is this British public higher expectation, which means the government now, I believe, from the data we're looking at, have a better mandate to start to push the British public towards the right kind of behaviours. And to your point, Tara, getting those messages the right way is key, because we as British public, we love scientists, we love doctors, we don't like politicians. We're not too keen on pollsters, by the way, either, but that's a different story. But if you look about the people we listen to, it's the scientists that the British public like to hear from, which is why you saw Sir Patrick Vallance, why you saw Chris Whitty, why you saw Jonathan Van Tam up there. Look at the US, it was film stars and sports stars that the public were listening to. So you've got to get that cultural point right in the same breath. But I think for me, one of the key lessons here is built around cultural trust. And whichever way you look at the numbers, there is now a higher expectation on our government and on private business to act than there was pre-pandemic.
Great, some really, really useful points there, I think. So I'm happy now to open up questions to the floor and online as well, if people have any questions for the panel. I'm going to start with Dave at the front. We can get a microphone to Dave.
We can probably hear him from there.
Yeah, it's just online.
I'm joking.
Yeah, so behavioural science says that most of what we do is habit, and that habits are really hard to change, and that's one of the reasons that it's very hard to take action on climate change. COVID has provided the world's largest mass habit change that we've ever seen in the history of humanity. How can we take advantage of that massive habit change that we're all going through to take better action on climate change?
Who wants to start with that one?
I could start to that, yeah. I was just commenting with Jim that that's the very question that's keeping me in a job at the moment. is actually working that one out, because yes, we are a creature of habit, but where did those habits start out? So they're created by the environment that you grow up in, the values that you have, and the sense of identity you have with the groups that you associate yourself with. And actually what you've noticed with the response to COVID, that yes, these kind of extrinsic habits did change, like we stopped driving to work, we completely changed our behavior, we wore masks, but ultimately deep down in your values, lots of habits didn't change. That your caring for your family made you more emphasize that sense of nurture as well. The value that you have for the NHS and stuff has really emphasized making sure that where your actual living habits are protective of that rather than destructive of that. And I think more than thinking about habits, I think what we at Climate Outreach try to think about is what really do people understand as a threat to their lifestyle? And so what do they really feel reluctant to change? What are they afraid of changing? And yeah, COVID gave someone or lots of people an opportunity to be like, actually real change is possible, and it can be really beneficial to a society. There is co-benefits like health of the environment and health of the community. So how can we understand that some threats aren't going to be an existential end to your comforts in life, but actually something that could be quite positive?
And I think we have the evidence, as I said earlier, COVID was a forced behavioural change to a large extent. We had to attenuate the way we behaved because that was what was expected and demanded. You look at the chaos at the airports this weekend and last weekend. People have just, no one's ever going to fly again. No, they are going to fly again. People are going to stop driving combustion cars. No, we're all back driving combustion cars again. So it's really, really ingrained, this behavioural piece. But what COVID has given us is an insight into how the world can change if it acts together. And again, one of the parallels I don't think works quite as well when you look at the environment and COVID is COVID was an international global response to something that threatened us as human, the here and now. And I think, COVID was an international response, but it was done in local pockets in countries, they covered their own strategies and ways of dealing with it. Whereas I think the global piece, and Stuart, you probably can talk better to this, is very much an international response. And it has to be, we're all in this together type of piece. And I think that is not necessarily a forced behavior, but a learned behavior. And again, the intervention of government, who now have a wider remit to do this because of what we've seen, I think is what's going to drive that behavioural change.
Stuart, do you have anything you want to add?
I just agree. Yes, at the international level, it's much more tricky in a sense because it's the tragedy in the horizon, and the collective interest response required, but different national interests driving that. I think there's an increasing awareness now about the disproportionate effects of climate change across the globe. They're very asymmetric, and the injustices.
I don't think we can hear you. Yeah, it's mine.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's better.
Great. I was just saying that the global level, yes, there's a collective action is required to the sort of tragedy of the horizons issue, which doesn't encourage collective action because of the very different national priorities. And there's differentiation and impact of climate change across the world. But at a fundamental level, it's all interconnected, of course, because an unhealthy world results in collapse, as you know, of natural systems and the food supply chain and the Gulf Stream and all these things, and possibly, which will have global consequences. So I think at the moment, the understanding, particularly from COP26, is really around the need for greater international cooperation around finance and knowledge transfer to help level up some of the disparities and to help countries who will struggle and be affected a whole lot more to take action to adapt, in particular, to preserve their sort of way of life and their countries, whilst targeting other countries, the high-emitting countries, to mitigate. There's some very creative solutions that are being proposed for that now. One, for example, is basically pay to stop. So they agreed last year at COP26 to pay the South African government to stop using coal power. And it's going to be a test case for behavioural change in some respects. And if it is successful, then that can be rolled out across the world for other countries as well.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, David.
Thank you. The impression that I got looking back at COVID was that the introduction of the vaccine was the game changer, because it allowed people to actually deal with the problems that were sitting in their homes, cowering out of the risk of getting COVID. But what struck me about that was this was very much led by government intervention, both in making sure that the research was done, funding it, and also making sure that there was a system in place for people to go and get the jabs. I don't see anything similar to the same extent for climate change, just thinking narrowly of the UK. So let me think of an example. At some point, we will all have to get rid of our gas boilers and have some other kind of sustainable heating system, like a heat pump or something. But at the moment, the impression I get is that the policy is that, oh, well, it'll happen as price comes down and people will shift. But actually, it's not clear to me that that will happen fast enough And I'm wondering, and my question is to you, do we need something, just in that particular instance, and there's others at point, do we actually need government intervention to make sure that things actually start to happen in people's homes? Because I think we leave it to people to do it themselves. It will just take too long.
I mean, yes is the answer. And on that one, but the point I will make on this one is if you look at British society, if you go and talk to the general public today, tomorrow, last week, week before, I'm afraid to say they're not talking about the environment. They're talking about how they're going to pay their energy bills, how they're going to pay for food, what's happening with inflation, why aren't my wages rising as fast as prices in the shops. They're talking about bad politics. They're talking about, I feel like if I'm going down the top 5, environment comes in at number 7 in their list of worries at the moment. Doesn't mean they don't care. It just means that as we stand today, they care less because there's other priorities in their lives. And I think if you go back over the last 40 years of polling British society, it's ebbs and flows. It was immigration, there was Brexit, there was the NHS. All of this moves at the same time. And what the government need to do is back some horses. So they backed wind power a number of years ago. We're now world leaders in wind power, as I'm sure you know. They need to do this backing again. If boilers then that's the one they've got to back. But to Stuart's earlier point, COVID was a crisis now. I could die, my parents could die, my children could be in trouble. The environment is 30, 40, 50 years away. So we're going to have to pull that forward. And as individuals, I don't think we're going to do that to a large extent. There has to be a really strong play by the government to pull that forward. And there's a massive tension there, as we were talking about, Tara, which is that a lot of society, whilst they want a better NHS, they don't want to pay more tax. It's called cognitive polyphasia. You've got 2 conflicting views you hold in your head at the same time, and you'll argue positively for both of them. And this is where we are with the environment, that we hold conflicting views. What do you mean I can't go on holiday to Spain and fly there? Yeah, because the money you spent on that, we want you to fix your boiler. Sorry? So, and that's the tension we have to overcome.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think when we refer to the social science to really understand why this is so difficult to really give government, because ultimately the work that we all do, even when we engage different audiences, different members of the public, is ultimately so they can force decision makers to make the right decision. For they are the people in power, they're going to make that decision. So why can't they? Like, we know we've got evidence that says 62% of the emissions that will get us to net zero by 2050 can be reached by behavior change, by the changes we make in our home and how we travel. But the government is not really seeing that social mandate to react to it. And for people who like social science, like we can give that a name. It's a victim of the 4 areas of psychological distancing. So you've got temporal. So it's when this is going to happen. Whereas COVID was happening right now. It was in your home. You saw your friends and family get sick. And then you've got spatial. It's like, where is it happening? We can see it happening in the countries that we find it really hard to relate to. And when we see the visual imagery in the press of polar ice caps melting, we've never been there. It's really hard to relate to. And then we've got spatial. So it's who, again, people we find it really hard to relate to at the moment. And then we've got the hypothetical, which kind of links in with like uncertainty and risk and really how bad is it going to be, which doesn't give you that agency to really know what to do with. So climate change is a victim of all 4 of those, which makes it extremely difficult to give the government a mandate to really commit.
Can I just jump in on that? I think a reasonably good example of how that's been manifested as being overcome in a sense, unfortunately, is in Australia recently. There's a federal election this last week.
Yeah.
And the prime ministership changed from the Conservative Party to the Labor Party. And one of the 2 main reasons for that was climate change. Australia, of course, lived through the horrific bushfires on the eastern seaboard a few years ago, where quite literally billions of species and millions and millions of hectares of land was completely burnt out, some of it which won't really regenerate for a long, long, long time. People were on holidays affected, they were sleeping out on the beaches to try and stay away from the burning trees and huts around them. So it became spatially very relevant, temporally very, very relevant. And as a result, that change in the ethos in the public come about. And so the Conservative government has lost power. And indeed, there's been a movement of these they call the teal candidates, which were independents who've kind of come together on a climate-based agenda. And the Greens Party as well has also increased its number of seats in key metropolitan areas. So Melbourne, for example, it has a Green seat in the centre of the town, basically. And Brisbane, historically a very conservative area, has swung the other way in many respects. So the policy has changed, but the immediacy was there. And so the issue is how do we bring it forward? Because we can't wait 50 years, because then it's too late.
We don't want to wait for a crisis.
We don't want to wait for a crisis. You can't wait for it's game over. Unless we bring the future forward now to address these issues and adapt, because we've proven we can, it's almost too late. And as you know, as climate scientists, the window to action to mitigate the worst is closing very rapidly.
So I'm going to take a question online, and then I'll take one from the back and then come to Peter.
All right, we've got a question from Edmund Henley. He asks, have there been any large-scale longitudinal studies on efficacy of COVID/climate change messaging to see what, if any, comms interventions have convinced particular segments, and to what extent given people have stayed convicted or lost conviction?
Anyone aware of any
Everyone's
studies?
looking at me, that's not fair.
Yeah.
Yes, there are some long-term studies, but COVID's only 3 years out of its track, so it's not particularly long-term. I think the key lessons, and you probably know more than this, specifically Tara, because of the work you do, the messages that resonate with people are the ones, that come from people they trust. And it's the third time we've said that. You've got, this what we call the veracity index. Right at the top, you have scientists, people in this room. Right at the bottom, you have advertising executives and bankers. It's always been us for the last 40 years. We've been measuring it. Politicians are in the bottom third. Pollsters just above politicians. Still just. And then nurses and teachers and lawyers and judges, etc. So actually who the messaging is coming from is a very, very key driver for the British population. And the messages themselves, they, again, I'll defer to you in a second, from what I've seen, they tend to defer to the more emotional side of human nature than necessarily the factual side of it, which I know is a slight dichotomy from scientists giving the messages. But you'll find that what COVID has done, if you look at people's purchase habits, we've now got a closer affinity to brands that share our values and less affinity to brands that we think are not doing right by social governance and environmental factors. And people are starting to move away. And that emotional value-based link to brands and governments is what's driving this.
So a longitudinal study that we've done at Climate Outreach, but with our partners at CAST in Cardiff, is called Britain Talks Climate. It's a free resource on our website, so I urge you to go and have a look. But the idea behind that was to segment the British population into 7 segments, not necessarily according to where they sit in the political spectrum, but more so with their values and ideals and what concerns them. And so that was great to have that research already available to us as we went then into the lockdowns. So we were able to then go back to those segments with an idea of how they feel their place is with regards to taking action on climate change, and ask them again in light of COVID, what narratives resonate with them, make them feel like that they are part of the picture. And the ones that came out for us was around balance. So broadly speaking, you could speak across the political spectrum about how the earth or nature and wildlife and the human population is in balance, and we are out of balance. And that generally works if you're having a conversation with someone of a different political leaning to you. And as well, a connection to the clean environment. So policies are positive if they will result in a clean and healthy environment as well. And I think something that I would say was directly related to our response to COVID is that people are seeing the role of ordinary people when we work together, the impact that we can have as well. So they were really interesting learnings for us, and that's something that we will then embed into our recommendations with partners for reaching beyond the usual suspects when we want to bring people on board to taking action on climate change. But I think, yeah, a lot more to learn. We have a lot more time to test again.
I might just jump that as well, actually, if I can. Two things. One, on the comment around consumer preferences, interestingly, at the other end of the spectrum, the World Economic Forum produces an annual report on global risks, and it has a top 10 risks over time, which you can track. The survey is basically the global 500 CEOs, and climate change is the #1 concern for global CEOs now, and the impact of climate change on their business and their ability to continue with a going concern over time and remain relevant and have consumers and so on and so forth. And of the top 10, 7 relate to the environment in one way or another, and biodiversity and water and such things. Social issues are also creeping in as well. That constellation has changed quite a lot over the last 10 or so years. But the heartening message, I think, is that the corporate world is very, very aware of this and are taking action, sometimes out of a place of moral concern, oftentimes out of a place of economic concern. And the economics for action are increasingly outweighing the economics for inaction over time. And that's probably perhaps a key message, I think, that we can take away, including for consumers, that early action helps to avert the cost of inaction down the track.
Just on that point, it's a really good point, because if you, on a poll we've just done, actually, if you ask consumers to rank E, S and G in there, S is the one they're most concerned about, the social element, which if you take it pre-COVID, it wasn't as high, and we think COVID has brought that social empathy part back to society stronger than before, and therefore everyone thinks it's about the environment. Actually, it is, but it's the biggest driver for consumers or citizens in the UK is actually that social element and making life less unequal, trying to remove inequality in society, which has become so very, very clear to us during the last 2 years about how unequal we are, and we're seeing it again now with the energy crisis.
Thank you. Question at the back.
Yes, sorry, I was going to ask about the role of education, partly related, because quite often when we give public talks or whatever as scientists, we're preaching to the converted because we have the same people come into our talks or whatever. So there's certain groups of people it's quite hard to reach or aren't that interested. So I'm just wondering if there, what we can do to reach those groups, but also if there's some deficiency in the current communication and education from scientists. And I know the RMetS done a lot of excellent work here, and a lot of people in the room are very proactive with that. But if there's something we're obviously missing in your view, please.
I could talk about that all day.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a great question when you refer to education, and I immediately was thinking, schools. And I've been listening in on some. So at the moment, there's the intersessional up on, where they really get down the stuff on paper that they're actually going to make a decision on at the next COP, so a COP27 coming on. And listening into one of them, there's a representative in Bangladesh who was saying the IPCC produces beautiful summary for policymakers, but we can't make head or tail of it. Why don't we make something that is accessible and that we could bring into schools? And I thought that was a fabulous idea, because you do have these young creative minds out there who are thinking about their future. They of all the people who are concerned about climate change, they are the ones there that are really concerned about climate change and open to doing some action on it. So why don't we give them the opportunity, bring it into the curriculum, bring it into schools, bring it into climate plans for schools, into education sector to really get those creative minds actually participating in it. Not just, and I know you're all well aware of like the deficit model, that doesn't work anymore. We can't just throw information at people. People need to be part of that two-way dialogue, and absolutely engaging with the education sector has to be critical in doing that.
Anyone wants to comment further? I'll take another question.
I was just going to say there's on that point, I think it's probably, and it comes back to how we communicate to the British population. is education is everything. So I'm sure you've all heard of the say-do gap, where we say one thing and do something completely different. There's actually a phenomenon I prefer called the believe true gap, that we're actually programmed. As society, people want to do the right thing. They want to try and do the right thing. But the problem is, if we think the right thing actually isn't the right thing, we're going to do what isn't the right thing. So what we believe informs how we act. And when you poll, again, when you do research across multiple countries, I'll pick the UK specifically, and you ask people if they think they know what they have to do to help the environment. 8 in 10 say, yeah, I know exactly what I should do. You then give them a list of things they should do, and almost without fail, across all countries, they overestimate the impact of the low impact pieces and they underestimate the high impact things they can do. And what we tend to do is we tend to do what we're told. So we all sort out recycling, because that's what we've been told is a good thing and we're helping the environment. It's about number 32 on a list of 50. And I've just remembered the work we're working with is the Institute of Physics, who've actually done the science behind it. And we're comparing the two together. And the one they don't think is important is having less children. And that's the number one biggest impact we can all have. So actually, as a society, we're doing what we think is the right thing, but it may not be the right thing. So we need the science to inform us what we should be doing. And then we need government to make it possible.
Just to add very quickly, I fully agree with both interventions. Like simplifying the message and making it personal is critical. You know, in the context of food prices and cost of living, that will only get worse in certain climate scenarios. So linking your current pain from different issues of cost of living to exacerbation through climate change is one way to make it real, or realer perhaps. There's probably a communication and knowledge gap here between bringing these dots together and connecting them and aha, create an experience for the consumer. So we've got a couple of points. Second point, education of the young is critical because CEOs listen. You know, I couldn't tell you how many board meetings I've sat in where afterwards the director said, oh yeah, I discussed this with my son or daughter at home, and they're really angry at me for not doing something. So education in schools, absolutely critical. It's a lever. It's like buying candy at the cash register. The kids nag their parents and they buy. The kids nag their parents at home to take climate action and they make their business do it. And linked to that is increasingly non-executive directors, NEDs, are playing a very crucial role in filling the education and knowledge gap on boards. And indeed, there's greater encouragement for climate scientists to be involved in the process now as well, and to help educate NEDs and indeed sit on boards in corporate Britain. So there's possibly roles there to help apply your communication knowledge in the context of corporate Britain. And we're seeing that as being a very influential way to bring about change. Some clients we're working with right now are going through quite significant transformation programs because of a request from an ed.
Wonderful. Right, I've got time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to go to Becky and then to Keith.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on the action and understanding connection. I and many of my colleagues spend a lot of time helping people to understand information in order to take action. But equally, there's some recent psychology, neuropsychology stuff that comes out that says, oh, it's not working. Do you want me to repeat it?
Yep.
It's a question about the connection between action and understanding. So I and many of my colleagues spend a lot of time hoping to improve communication, to improve understanding, to cause action. But there's some quite recent neuropsychology outputs that say actually it's more the actions drive the understanding. And this perhaps is a particular example with COVID, where you're told what to do and then you're justifying what you do and you're being consistent with what you're doing by understanding why you're doing it. And I just wondered whether that's something that you've come across in that relationship, or how that understanding drives action, but action can drive better understanding, and how that dynamic might play out. What your comments were on that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I won't be able to speak too much about, but I know I have a colleague, Adam Corner, who would be fantastic at answering this, that certainly like there's a leveraging effect that comes with taking a small action. And yes, we poo-poo recycling and switching off your lights at night because we know that doesn't really drive the response we need to take. But actually, these are starter actions that open up an opportunity for someone to say, oh, I've done that, and I really relate to doing that, and maybe I can do this, and it's like a step-by-step process, and there's a ton of literature on that. I'm not going to even try and condense it for you, but certainly that is something that we would in conversations, or I would advise partners in conversations to leverage as a starter conversation, like, oh, that's interesting, you recycle, so why do you do that? Why is that important to you? And would you consider this? And it's kind of, yeah, taking that person on a wider journey to more impactful action. Yeah.
Can I just add to that to say I've witnessed the same thing in the corporate world. So many companies are at different stages of the journey. And for a lot of them, it's, how do you eat an elephant? They're overwhelmed with the number of things they need to do, the scale, the number of people involved, the degree of integration the organization needs to have. And similarly, our view is do something, start. We'll meet you where you are, help you understand where you are, figure out with you where you need to be, and then develop a roadmap to get there. But starting the journey is really, really important, and getting some champions internally who can sort of agitate for change and become the super nodes, who galvanize the hearts and minds of their colleagues. Then you get the sort of a flow-on effect from that. So yes, we've empirically, it's definitely, or anecdotally rather, witnessed that through our clients as well.
Great. Can we get a mic to Keith, and then last question?
It's my turn to ask mostly Tara a question. If we think of another environmental crisis, ozone depletion, it actually seems to contravene some of your things of what matters, because the where was 10 kilometers up in the Antarctic, and that what it means to me was a small, well, not small, but a greater probability of getting skin cancer 20, 30 years in the future. And yet with that issue, once government and industry got aligned, which it took a while to do, and because there were ready replacements, we were able to act very quickly on ozone depletion. And it seems to me we're getting to that position now with climate change where government and industry are aligned. So I wonder whether some of the things you said that were important were really as important as you said, if we acted like that on ozone depletion.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keith. That's a really interesting example. And yeah, in my studies, looking back at like case studies of where real change happens, the ozone layer is always one that comes up time and time again of like a government intervention that worked. Bear in mind the time that was happening. And this is me putting my own kind of personal understanding behind it, is that this is at a time before really deep skepticism came into play and took some really deep positions of power in using areas of uncertainty, working with merchants of doubt to really sow seeds in elements of, well, responding to climate change, we need to overhaul completely how we live our lives. But responding to the impact that we're having on the ozone layer, thankfully, there actually was a solution. Stop using CFCs, and a government intervention was then able to put that into place. And yes, it took a bit of time, and yes, there were some issues with doing that, but it happened. And I would argue to you that that CFC ozone depletion problem to solve is complex, but a lot less complex to the changes we actually need to do to target climate change.
I don't doubt that they were easier. They were a lot easier, but it's still the government put it way higher up the agenda than the public might have done at the time.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone has had experience of ozone depletion skeptics. I don't think I've ever seen. Has there? Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe you could tell us more.
Well, the whole industry was skeptical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Antarctic ozone hole was really sorted out.
So maybe there is more to learn. Yeah.
Great, thank you for the fantastic range of questions, and thank you very much for the in-depth answers. It was excellent panel discussion. So can you join me just in thanking Stuart, Tara and Jim, please, for an excellent panel.